Have you ever wondered what happens when heroes aren't such heroes? What Marvel showed us with the Thunderbolts is that not everything is black and white in the world of superpowers. And that's exactly what makes this team so fascinating and, at the same time, scary. They started out as villains disguised as heroes, and that already raises eyebrows. After all, how can you trust a team that hides behind double masks? What's more, what makes us believe that the path of redemption for someone who was once an enemy can be genuine? In the real world, how many times do we come across people or situations that seem good but have ulterior motives? Thunderbolts goes beyond stories of common heroes or Avengers. They touch on something deeper, the fine line between what is right and what is wrong. And that's when you'll realize how this team stands out from all the others. If you think you've seen it all about Marvel heroes, prepare to delve into a darker side, where loyalties are questionable and intentions are not always noble. Shall we find out everything about them? Because the truth about the Thunderbolts could completely change your perspective on what it means to be a hero. The movie, Thunderbolts, from the Marvel Cinematic Universe is already generating excitement, especially after the release of its first trailer. The team includes familiar faces like Yelena Belova, Winter Soldier, and U.S. Agent, heroes who already carry with them a series of intense stories and complicated pasts. The big twist here is that this lineup didn't come out of nowhere. In Marvel Comics, the Thunderbolts were born in the late 90s. Over time, they ended up gaining an interesting parallel with DC's Suicide Squad. Yes, heroes and villains side by side, but with their own rules, or lack thereof. Now, what's interesting is how the Thunderbolts operate in practice. In the comics, Baron Zemo, a strategic villain, saw an opportunity in the chaos after the Onslaught event, which left Earth without its great heroes, the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. He then gathered his masters of evil and, under a new identity, formed the Thunderbolts. The clever move was to pretend to be a hero, taking advantage of the moment of vulnerability to gain the public's trust. Just imagine, villains disguised as heroes, walking freely down the streets and being celebrated. Do you think no one would notice? Well, to a certain extent, they didn't. And it's worth noting that Zemo wasn't alone in this. He knew very well that to maintain this theater of heroes, he would need a committed team, or at least until they realized the potential of truly being seen as heroes. And this scheme was so well orchestrated that, for a while, it worked. But like any farce, sooner or later things start to crumble. That's when the Thunderbolts begin to become more than just a team of villains with ulterior motives. When the Avengers and the Fantastic Four faced off against Massacre, no one expected the tragic outcome that followed. The apparent sacrifice of these heroes left the planet in a state of vulnerability. Imagine living in a world without the heroes you trust the most. The feeling of loss and despair was palpable, and who was left? A few isolated heroes, like Spider-Man, and teams of mutants still facing the prejudice of the population. But the absence of the Avengers and the Fantastic Four was felt in every corner of the Marvel Universe. Baron Zemo, one of Marvel's greatest villains, saw a golden opportunity in this chaos. Noticing that the most powerful heroes seemed to have vanished, he devised a cunning plan. Disguised as heroes, he and his team of Masters of Evil emerged under the name of Thunderbolts. The idea was simple but extremely dangerous: to gain the public's trust and then manipulate them to his advantage. And who better to infiltrate than those no one would suspect? Zemo's cleverness in seizing the moment was, at the very least, masterful. Zemo's scheme is an excellent example of how even the darkest moments can be exploited by sharp minds. If anyone had known about this strategy, they could have avoided significant problems, right? Think about it, when the most trustworthy people disappear, who steps in to fill that void? Zemo understood that trust is a powerful weapon, and he used it for his own benefit. And it's at this point that the story begins to gain new layers. During the Civil War event, the tension in the Marvel Universe was at its peak, with heroes divided between those supporting the Superhuman Registration Act and those opposing it. And who was there to take advantage of this chaos? Him again, Baron Zemo. But this time, he decided to play a little differently. With the support of the pro-registration faction, Zemo assembled a new lineup of the Thunderbolts, now composed of villains like Venom and Lady Deathstrike. Zemo's plan was no longer just to gain the public's trust, he wanted to control the operations from within. This shift in tactics shows that sometimes power doesn't lie with those who have the noblest names, but with those who control the players on the board. During this period, the Thunderbolts began to become an unstoppable force, with none of the scruples of traditional heroes. A good example of this is the inclusion of notorious villains who, unlike heroes like Captain America, did not hesitate to use more extreme methods to achieve their goals. Who would have thought that, amid the chaos, villains like Venom would end up playing such a decisive role? However, this raised an interesting question: are heroes and villains, at their core, two sides of the same coin? The Thunderbolts of this era made it clear that power corrupts, and the line separating heroes and villains is not always as clear as it seems. And under the leadership of Norman Osborn, things only began to heat up. After all, what could go wrong with a former Green Goblin in charge? In 2016, the Thunderbolts returned under the leadership of Winter Soldier, Bucky Barnes, in a setting that seemed as turbulent as the team's previous formations. This time, the objective was more straightforward and even urgent: to prevent S.H.I.E.L.D. from manipulating the Cosmic Cube, a powerful weapon capable of altering reality. Bucky, as someone who knew the weight of manipulations and the loss of control, saw in this role an opportunity to act directly against these threats. A hero, but with a much darker, almost anti-heroic approach that reflected the tone of the entire team. This version of the Thunderbolts was undoubtedly different from the previous ones. Instead of villains seeking redemption, we now had a group with a clearer and almost desperate mission to prevent greater powers from manipulating the world's fate. Here, it becomes clear how Marvel always manages to connect the comics to real life. Often, we see institutions or greater forces trying to control what they shouldn't. And just like Bucky and his team, sometimes the only solution is to rebel against that tide and fight for a more genuine truth, even if it requires sacrifices. However, like everything in comics, the story of the Thunderbolts led by Bucky was not long-lived. During the Secret Empire crossover, the group disbanded abruptly, leaving a sense of an unfinished cycle. Some members even returned to the old game, rejoining none other than Baron Zemo. It seems that, in the end, the past always finds a way to pull us back, doesn't it? And with that, we can't help but wonder, do the Thunderbolts really have a destiny they can choose?
Now that you know the journey of the Thunderbolts, the question that remains is, what would you do if you were in their shoes? Redemption is something we all seek at some point in our lives, but the big question is how far we are willing to go to achieve it. The story of this team makes us reflect on our own choices and how the past can influence the future. Does everyone deserve a second chance? Or better yet, are you ready to give that chance to yourself? If you relate to this journey of ups and downs, full of dilemmas, perhaps it's time to rethink some attitudes in your daily life. The path to redemption is not easy, but as the Thunderbolts teach us, it can be incredibly transformative. So, what will you do with all this knowledge? Are you ready to put it into practice and change your own story? If so, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell because we have much more to share about the Marvel Universe, heroes, Avengers, and of course, the deepest secrets of the Thunderbolts.